have, yeah, we've got a quorum. I think
I
we'll
count
wait a couple
7,
more
do
minutes.
you?
Yeah, that's what we have. Great, so we've pretty much got about everyone. We'll just get started here. Welcome everyone to the December 1st meeting of the Missoula Consolidated Planning Board. We've made it to December this year. So thank you everyone for joining the meeting, who's watching via Zoom. What we'll do tonight on this new platform is that when I call for public comment, if we have that tonight, participants who'd like to comment can use the raise hand function in order to be recognized. And so what you'll do is click on the icon in the Zoom software, click on the icon labeled participants at the bottom center of your computer screen. And then at the bottom of the window, click the button that's labeled raise hand. And I'll call the names that are listed when you enter the webinar, and you'll need to unmute your microphone to make your comments. And if you join by telephone, you can still make comments, and you can raise and lower your hand by pressing *9 and mute and unmute yourself using *6. And if you're participating by phone tonight, I'll call on you by reading the last 4 digits of your phone number. And then you'll mute the device you're watching the meeting on, which is an important thing to do. I'll remind you if you don't, and press *6 to unmute your telephone. Okay. So with that out of the way, we'll move on to the roll call. Could we please have a roll call?
Thank you, Vince. Andy Mefford.
Present.
Andy Mefford's present. Dave Loomis.
Present.
Dave Loomis is present. Sean McCoy.
Here.
Sean McCoy is present. Caroline Lauer. Caroline Lauer is just entering. Caroline Lauer?
Here.
Is here. Thank you. Josh Schrader.
Here.
Josh Schrader is present. Neva Hassanen. Neva Hassanen is present. Tung Pham.
Sprouts Toon Pham, and I'm here.
Thank you very much. And welcome. Vince Caristo.
Present.
Vince Caristo is present. Shane Morrissey.
Present.
Shane Morrissey is present. Mr. Chair, there are 8 regular members and 1 alternate present. Would you like to appoint Mr. Morrissey as a regular voting member tonight?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Very good. Moving on to the approval of the minutes. We have 2 minutes tonight for approval from October 20th and October 27th of 2020. So if anyone would like to suggest revisions or additions to the minutes, please do at this time, or any other comments. If there are none, I'd please ask for a motion to approve the minutes, either separately or both at the same time.
So moved.
Okay, Neva's moved to pass both minutes. Is there?
Together,
maybe
yeah.
At the same time, is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Seconded by Josh. Okay, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes. Okay, at this point, we'll move on to public comment from members of the public on items that are not on tonight's agenda. So if anyone is participating in this meeting via Zoom or telephone and would like to make a comment, we have instructions on the screen here. I will repeat them here for the record, if I can find them. So you use the raise hand function to do this, which should be in your Zoom platform software, located in the participants section of your screen. And if you're calling by telephone, you can raise your hand to get in line to speak by pressing *9, and then unmute yourself by pressing *6. So we will still give a few minutes here, as we typically have been doing this year, for people to call in. Heather, do we know if there's anybody viewing? I guess that's a question. Just worth asking.
And I'm wondering, so what's the change with this new format? What's the difference here?
You're saying what's the difference, Neva?
Yeah, from the webinar versus the Zoom we were doing. I would like to know who's in the audience. I realized last time that, or the last couple of times, you know, when we were doing it in the previous way, that, you know, I can't really see like who is in the room. And, you know, that would be nice to, just like you just asked. You know, is anybody out there that might want to comment, right? If we were in a room together, we would see that. And so I don't know if that's doable with the technology, and, you know, God bless. It's, you know, it's kind of crazy to deal with, but I'm just raising that. Yes.
That's a great question, Neva. I don't know if staff has anything to add or respond to the question. I think I'd be interested to know as well.
If people are participating in the Zoom meeting as attendees, they can see the meeting much as you can at this point, and they have the option to raise their hand. And at that point, I'll be monitoring that as a host if someone was present, and I can allow them to speak. If someone is viewing out on YouTube or over MCAT, then we still have a bit of a challenge in the sense that we don't necessarily know that they're out there watching. Then they have the option to either call in as they have in the past. But it is hard to say. I mean, I can hop on my phone and look at YouTube and see who might be viewing and kind of guess, but I don't know who those people are.
And we don't know whether anybody's there or not. Like, that's, if you knew, even if you knew, it's different, you know, than all of us knowing who's out there. Right? You know what I mean, Heather? And there isn't a way to do it so we can see everybody.
Well, the way I'm seeing people is if I open up the participants or the panelist list, I don't know if what you see when you open that up, honestly, because my view is slightly different than yours.
Well, yeah, I see 17 panelists and 2 attendees. So maybe this new approach solves some of this problem, but, you know, in this previous ones, you couldn't see who was in the so-called audience.
Yes, you can see just what I can see
Okay.
based on what you've said.
Okay.
We don't have a waiting room lobby like we used to. Panelists and attendees join automatically. And the only mystery is those people who might be watching out on YouTube or over MCAT and then choose to call in because that is what they have access to, is that conference call number.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much. That helps.
Heather, do you know if people call the phone number that's on the screen right now, will they be connected to the Zoom meeting and show up as an attendee, or will it be, are they calling essentially the same system that we've been using this year where we can't see them and don't know who's called?
To the best of my knowledge, they'll show up similarly to how they have before. It'll be a phone number, which we'll need to identify.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, with that, I think this will be the last call for public comments. We've been chatting away the public comment period. I think folks have had a chance to call in or raise their hand if they would have liked to. So we'll move on there to the staff announcements. Staff, would you like to cover the announcements, or would you like for me to go through them?
I think either way works.
Oh, there you are, Karen. Great. Yeah, why don't you walk through the announcements for us, Karen? Thanks.
Sure. First, there's the welcome to Tung Pham, and maybe do you want to do a little bit of an introduction about who you are?
That would be great. I'd love to hear that. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm excited to get a little bit involved with Consolidated Planning Board. I realized I didn't have enough Zoom meetings in my life, so I thought I'd sign up for more. I grew up here in Missoula, went to Hellgate High School, left after graduation, and I ran off to the East Coast for college and kind of found my way into the tech industry, and was living in San Francisco. And then about 3 years ago, moved back to Missoula, and I saw this as a good opportunity to get back involved with the community. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and help learn a little bit more about Missoula planning.
Welcome, Tung. It's great to have you.
I think everyone knows that Peter Benson resigned. So that was the next item. And then the third item is that Dave Loomis has been moved from alternate member to regular member. Congratulations on your promotion, Dave.
Way to go, Dave.
And then the last item is that your December 15th meeting has been canceled. So enjoy your free Tuesday night. We do have items both for January 5th and January 19th, I believe it is. Both of those so far are county zoning actions. One is a new zoning district up in the Y area on January 5th, and the other is the proposal to put in place cryptocurrency mining, the permanent zoning to replace the interim zoning that's been in place for the last 2 years. So that's what I know about your upcoming schedule so far. And that's it for staff announcements.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for the update. And a look at what's ahead here for us. So we don't have any public hearings tonight, but we do have two special presentations from staff that we'll move into right now. The first of which is an update on the long-range transportation plan growth scenarios from Aaron Wilson at the Metropolitan Planning Organization. Aaron, if you're there, or Jennifer.
Yep, we're both here. Thanks, Vince. Yeah, so thanks for taking some more time out for us to talk about transportation planning. Feels like I'm trying to remember the last time we were here to give a quick update. I don't think it was too long ago, but we've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of months, and I think now we're at a point where an exciting point where we are really looking at some different ways to invest transportation dollars. And so I think it will be hopefully a really interesting conversation or presentation for all of you, and an opportunity to weigh in on some ideas or thoughts that you're having in terms of growth and the transportation investments we can make to support that or direct that, or how we prioritize those funding sources. So Jennifer, I'll let Jennifer get started on the PowerPoint while I just introduce. So for those of you who are new or haven't met, I'm Aaron Wilson. I'm the city's infrastructure and mobility planning manager, and part of that role is managing the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization, which does all of the regional transportation planning. Well, maybe not all, but we're tasked with doing the regional transportation planning for Missoula. And the primary way we do that is through the long-range transportation plan that we update every 4 years. And so we're in the thick of our current update of the plan that was last adopted in 2016. And so we've got, I think, some, as I mentioned, some interesting materials to present on our scenarios this week. Joined by Jennifer Whelan with Nelson Nygaard. They're the consultants who are helping us with this project and have been doing some tremendous work to get us where we are today. So we're going to sort of tag team this presentation a little bit and try to get through it. So with that, I think we'll get started. So just as a little bit of background on how we got where we are today, just thinking about public engagement and drawing on the community's participation and values and input to craft scenarios that we think are going to help us achieve the region's goals, and how we can help support some of the other plans and outcomes that the community is hoping to achieve. So if you'll remember, we started way back in March with a kickoff on a first Friday. We had, back when we could have in-person meetings and people gathering and talking about things, we had a great event, I thought, for a planning meeting where we had several hundred people show up, and we had a gallery with sort of the history of transportation over the last 150 years or so, and then had some targeted questions about where we want to go in the future. So it was a good way to sort of get grounded in how we got where we are today, and then where do we want to go, and how do we want to make investments that will get us there. We've also been meeting regularly with our committees, both the MPO committees and our long range plan, citizen advisory committee, and technical advisory committee. And so there's been a lot of input through that forms how we got where we are today. We did some values and goals surveys, which we'll talk a little bit about, forming sort of the basis for this plan, and how we're going to help make some of the other decisions throughout the project. And then we've done some fun things like trying to get people to give us their big ideas for transportation, which I feel like have included things as diverse as ponies, or high-speed rail, or passenger rail, and so that was a way to sort of get people thinking about transportation in a creative way. So all that to say, we've been doing a fair amount of engagement starting in March throughout the summer, and leading us to where we are today. So that the core of this plan, and I won't spend too much time on this because we've presented these in past meetings, but we do want to always come back to the goals that we've set in this plan, and that are based on that community engagement, and thinking about how we make decisions in prioritizing. And so we've landed on 5 fairly straightforward but comprehensive goals that address things like improving safety and promoting health, knowing that having a safe transportation system where people aren't dying or being seriously injured in crashes, and that are creating a healthy way for people to get around. Advancing sustainability and community resilience, that those are really key goals that we hear in every plan that we do in Missoula. We're building on our last plan in terms of expanding mobility choices so that people can choose which mode, and that all of those modes have as much access as possible. And so people can choose the mode of transportation that best suits their needs and their interests. And then we want to create communities, connect our communities to create a more equitable region, and thinking about how transportation investments can have an impact on things like economic equity, or addressing our Invest Health neighborhoods, or other issues with urban to rural connectivity in the region. And then finally, we want to make sure we're investing strategically to boost economic vitality, that the transportation system is really essential to how we grow, and how we can grow our economy, and make sure that people are able to access jobs or services or other business that makes Missoula function. So those are the goals that we've developed based on that input, and we'll be coming back to those regularly in this presentation. So then the next step was to get to the actual transportation projects that we will be using for the scenarios that we're presenting, and will ultimately become the projects that we're recommending for funding in the long range transportation plan. And we started with a broad process to collect projects and ideas. We went out to the public. We had a call for projects. We had virtual meetings. We had online tools, just to gather as many ideas as possible. I think we ended up with over 200 different projects throughout the region that we then needed to start to whittle down, or think about how we prioritize. So the next step is screening those projects and programs and ideas for projects that are appropriate for a long-range transportation plan, screening out things like programs or other investments that maybe aren't a specific infrastructure project, but that will still be included in the plan, just not as part of these investment scenarios. And then we scored all those projects using a number of metrics that related back to those goals and started to rank projects into tiers based on how well they're going to move us towards different goals like affordability and equity and safety and connectivity. And so that brings us to where we are today, which is developing, we've developed several scenarios and included those highest ranking projects in some way in one or more of these scenarios. And then from there, we'll move into developing our final recommended plan and start prioritizing projects by funding and when we think we'll fund them. So the timing of projects. So with scenario planning, I think it's worth taking a minute just to talk about why, particularly in transportation planning, we use scenarios to help us evaluate plans and potential outcome or potential strategies that we might take. And one of the key pieces of this that we'll talk about is wanting to explore the relationship between land use and transportation, both from the perspective of how are we growing and where are we growing and what impact does that have on transportation and vice versa, but also how transportation connects people to services or different parts of neighborhoods and how transportation can really facilitate those connections that are key to how we grow and what's happening in our community. It also allows us to evaluate and communicate the different trade-offs and benefits associated with a multimodal transportation system or different kinds of investments in different modes. So those decisions have different impacts, and it's not always this one is better than another, but this one might have more of an impact. One project might have an impact on housing affordability, and another might have an impact on access to jobs or services or things like that. So we're using scenarios to really evaluate different outcomes based on a set of investments. And that helps us understand how those different strategies interact to improve the overall performance of the transportation system and which goals we are making more or less progress on with those investments. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are picking one of these scenarios as a winner or a loser or somewhere in between, but it's helping us understand the impact of the decisions we're making so that we can maybe one of these scenarios rises to the top when we really like it, but there are sort of tweaks that we want to make to help it further a particular goal, or there are some specific projects that we want to make sure we include. So this will hopefully give us that information to make those decisions. So before we get into the transportation network scenarios, this is a little bit of a rehash, I think, of what we presented the last time we were here in terms of talking about growth scenarios. And we're calling these two different growth scenarios, but really what they are two different potential growth outcomes that we can use to evaluate how land use interacts with the different transportation investments we're making. So we can look at how one scenario interacts with each of these different growth and what that growth pattern, what the impact has on the transportation system and how well it's functioning. So there are a couple of key points to these growth scenarios. One is that we used a consistent growth rate, but directed that growth to different areas. And we did that partially because growth in Missoula has been remarkably steady over the last 10 or 20 years. There may have been peaks and valleys and some fluctuation, but overall we've grown at a pretty stable 1% to 2% growth a year for quite a while. We recognize there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, but we can't really predict that. And so this gives us a tool to look at where that growth is going to happen and knowing that maybe it happens in 15 years or maybe 30 years, but the overall growth should be consistent. We also recognize that Missoula has very progressive land use and growth policies, and we wanted to respect that in these scenarios and not assume that we're going to drop those policies and take some other growth approach, but look at different ways that we could implement those strategies. So that comes down to thinking about our business as usual growth is where we've been seeing trends in growth throughout the region, where there is capacity in the current city and county growth policies and zoning, but not necessarily directing it. It's sort of assuming growth, business as usual is assuming growth happens in those areas as it has over the last 5 to 10 years and maybe isn't as focused as it could be. So then the strategic growth on kind of the flip side of that is looking at areas that we have either master planned or has capacity for a lot more growth than what we're seeing currently, and thinking about what happens if we really focus that growth in those areas before we start assuming other areas on the fringe develop. So those are kind of our two scenarios. Again, the strategic growth assumes that more growth is focused in the urban core. So areas like downtown and the Mullen area master plan, and the area along Brooks Street, where we've been doing some transportation and land use planning recently, and areas where we know that there's a lot of capacity for infill and growth, but maybe we've been seeing some of that, but not as much as we're capable of. So looking at what happens when we really focus the growth in those areas, instead of outlying areas like west of the Mullen area, past the airport, or in Target Range Orchard Homes, or out in other parts of the county beyond this urban area. So it's really, at the end of the day, a focus of more maximizing our growth in the core of the region. So those are our two growth scenarios that we use to help evaluate the different transportation scenarios that Jennifer is going to talk about.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. And maybe before we jump into the transportation scenarios, Aaron, do you want to see if there are questions on the two approaches to growth first?
Yeah, it's kind of a lot of info. So if there are questions on that, or we can move on.
Anybody need clarification on the business as usual or strategic growth approaches?
Well, I have a question, and maybe it's not a clarification, but one of the things I thought was really interesting in our discussion around the Mullen area plan was the idea that we might have traffic going both ways, so that we might be able to encourage not only, traffic going towards downtown every morning and away from downtown in the evening, but that there would be actually people that might move, or not move, but work on the edge, work in the Mullen area. And how does that figure in, Aaron or Jennifer? I thought that was a really great concept. It's like, oh yeah, one way to address this is not to have everything that's economic, in one place.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it gets into a little bit more detail where the way we model transportation and use these growth scenarios, we have a travel demand model. And Jennifer will talk a little bit maybe about some of the results from that, but it looks at households and employment, and the way we structured these different scenarios, we essentially assumed that the jobs in some way would follow the households. So there's this sort of ratio we use of jobs to housing that's based on sort of existing distribution. So the more you concentrate households in an area, when we're coming up with those employment projections, we're sort of doing the same thing with employment. So they basically follow the houses. So if you put a lot more households in the Mullen area, we're also putting more jobs in that. And so the model will reflect that when it's looking at travel patterns. That said, it's an imperfect science, and it's really hard to predict how much of that will happen and where, but it gives us a sense of where are trips occurring and what does that look like on our transportation system. So short answer is yes, we did consider that to some extent, but maybe not in as much detail as we would all love to have.
Well, it's something to strive for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Aaron, do you think you could connect this to the city and county growth policy for us? I guess, my question is specifically, would both growth scenarios be possible under the current zoning and growth policies at the city and county level, or what changes need to occur for one or both of the scenarios? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would say our goal, as I mentioned, we wanted to make sure these scenarios were within what we've planned for in the growth policy. We didn't want to go outside the growth policies necessarily. The one I guess the one exception might be the Mullen Area Master Plan, which as we were developing this wasn't officially adopted yet. And so but it's far enough along, we thought it would be worth looking at what are the impacts of that plan. So that's the one area where we maybe went above and beyond what our current land use and growth policies would allow. And then everywhere else, we looked at existing land use and zoning and what are the capacity, what's the existing development in those areas, where do we have capacity, and then made sure that we didn't put more households in an area than the capacity would allow. And when we set those capacities, we don't even go to 100%, what's the maximum density of zoning? We sort of scale that back, knowing that as you put in streets and not every development maximizes density. And so we tried to have a somewhat conservative, but still, looking at how to maximize the use of those areas. Does that answer your question, Vince?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll take us into the transportation scenarios from here. Erin, thank you for that. And thanks to all of you for the good questions. I think, one thing that is really important for us to keep in mind as we think about the role of the long range transportation plan and what we get to decide as we do this is that we don't get to make choices about how growth is directed. And that's part of the reason that we felt like it was really important to stay within the city's not the cities, but the city and counties adopted policies. And so what we hope to be able to illustrate through these couple of growth scenarios are just, as Erin said earlier, the ways that making decisions about how we grow can really do more for our transportation investments, and the ways that our transportation investments can do more for the land use decisions that we make. So as we move into talking a little bit about the results of some of our analysis, I think you'll be able to see a little bit of that start to play out. So I'm going to introduce you to our 3 transportation scenarios, and then again, we'll pause for a minute for some questions before we talk about how these performed in the analysis that we did. So Erin did a great job of describing why we do scenario planning and sort of what's included here. Just like Missoula has really progressive land use policies, there's a lot to build upon when it comes to the transportation network. Sometimes when we do long-range transportation plans, there are communities that are really focused in one direction or another. A community might be really focused on expanding capacity for vehicles and freight, and another community might be really focused on building out an active transportation network that just doesn't exist right now. In Missoula, you're really fortunate to have a very strong multimodal network to start. And so we felt like as we moved forward to develop the transportation scenarios, we had the opportunity to build on that in all 3 of the scenarios that we're putting forward. So you'll see differences in them, but they do each incorporate all modes of transportation. Erin talked a bit about our scoring process and moving from 200 some projects down to a smaller number that is included in the scenarios. There are probably 125 or so projects that are mixed and matched between the different scenarios. And all of them do help to advance the regional goals. That is part of the reason that we go through the project evaluation and scoring first, so that we're able to move forward those that are likely to do the most toward our goals. A couple other important notes for you as you start to look at these scenarios. So they're financially constrained. These are not scenarios that assume we're going to have as much money as we want to have over the next 30 years. And we were fairly conservative about the initial revenue estimates that we used, but there are a couple of important pieces to that. So you will see in all 3 of the scenarios, there's a group of projects that we refer to as the committed projects. And those cost about $110 million. So those committed projects are projects that are funded and moving forward. And they are in the city's capital improvement program, for example. They're in the MPO's transportation improvement program. So these are projects that are moving forward. Some of them still need a little bit more funding, but we built that into our assumptions. And then the projects beyond those committed projects are limited to a total of about $178 million in each scenario. So one of the things that you'll see as we start to look at these is that the scenarios have different numbers and different types of projects, but they do all fit within that 178 million. So I know 178 million can sound like a lot of money in the abstract, but when you think about it over the course of 30 years, and you think about how expensive infrastructure projects can be, you'll see that it can go quite quickly as we start to dive into these. So I wanted to frame that for you just as we start to think about how these scenarios were built, and then just give you a little bit of an introduction to all three of them before we look at some maps together. So in the three scenarios, new connections, enhanced connections, and regional equity, we tried to set some bookends, and we tried to make these scenarios different enough that we would see different outcomes. As I mentioned, there's a lot to build on in Missoula, and so in some cases when we start to evaluate the differences between the scenarios, they're not huge, but we did try and really group projects in different ways so that we would see some differences. I also want to mention that because this is a 30-year plan, you'll hear Erin and I talk about some projects as, a protected bike lane or a complete streets project. These projects are not designed. We can't tell you exactly what the right facility is going to be in every case. Because this is a 30-year plan, there's a lot more planning and design work that has to happen as projects are funded and start to move forward. So I know it can be easy to get fixated on a particular intersection and exactly what's going to happen there, but I would encourage you to kind of think a little bit more at a system or an area level as we move through these tonight. So for those of you who are wanting to dig in to more detail, there is a lot more information available on our website, and we'll give you links to all of that as we go. But all of the maps that I'm going to show, as well as detailed project lists for each of the scenarios, more information about the analysis is all available for you to learn a little bit more about. So I'll just give kind of a high-level introduction to each of these scenarios, and then again, happy to answer some questions about them. So let me take just a second, since this is the first map that we're looking at, and just orient you to the different colors and lines that you'll see as we move through these three slides. So I mentioned the committed projects, which are those that are funded and moving forward, and you'll see those in black or this dark gray color on all of the maps moving forward. Again, these are funded or have dollars allocated to them. This Mullen area master plan, the build roads that are associated with that is a really good example of the types of projects that are committed. So that's something you'll see on each of the maps. And then the other colors of projects that you'll see are purple, which are complete streets and roadway projects. And so when we talk about complete streets projects, those are projects that improve conditions for people traveling by all modes, whether you're driving, operating a freight vehicle, walking, biking, or taking the bus. There is a little something for everyone in complete streets projects. So those you'll see in purple. And then the green projects are those that are active transportation projects. So those are walking and biking projects, or walking, biking, and rolling projects. They are sometimes trails, they are sometimes bridges or on-street facilities, like a protected bike lane, for example, or a multi-use path. But those are what you'll see in green. And then as we move on to other maps, you'll start to see orange projects show up, which are safety-focused projects, primarily at intersections, but a few along different roadways as well. So that's what you can look for as we move along the maps. So let's start with the new connections scenario, which is what we have here on the screen. What we tried to do in the new connections scenario is really focus on new routes. And again, new routes for all modes. So a lot of the projects in this scenario are bigger projects. They are more expensive projects that require a greater level of investment because they are building a new section of roadway, for example, like the extension of Russell Street up to I-90. In other cases, they are building a new bridge, like the Riverfront Triangle non-motorized bridge. So this connection between downtown and McCormick Park. A lot of the new connections investments are, as you see from the map, really focused on complete streets. So thinking about a lot of corridors, a lot of longer projects, and then a few of these really signature active transportation projects that do build out the network a little bit more than it is today. So that's just a few highlights of what you'll see in the new connections scenario. So we're going to contrast that next with a bit of the other end of the spectrum. So instead of new connections, we'll take a look at a scenario that's called enhanced connections. And our focus in setting up the enhanced connections scenario was to really think about how we improve the existing networks that exist, today. So this scenario really focuses on both maintaining and improving the networks that exist. And it also really tries to focus on the ways that we complete investments that have already been made or that are underway to support infill development and to support a more inward growth approach. So you'll see in this scenario right away, I think, and apologies if anybody is colorblind, aside from seeing the committed projects, you'll see a lot more green on this map than you did on the last map. And so those are more active transportation projects. They are more affordable projects in many cases, and you'll see a lot more of them overall. You'll also see a lot of the intersection improvements start to pop up in orange. So an example of one of the intersection improvements is the Brook Street and Stevens Avenue intersection improvements. And this is really about the ways that we improve safety for people traveling by all modes at a really key intersection. A few other examples of key projects that are included in the enhanced connections scenario is, if we look at downtown Missoula, the front and main conversion to two-way streets and the multimodal improvements associated with that. It's another key connection. And then one other element that we really tried to focus on in this scenario was, as I mentioned, connecting some of the planned and funded investments to the rest of the network. So a good example of that are these two little projects here, which are new bike facilities, probably protected bike lanes on England Boulevard and Union Pacific to Palmer. And the intent here was really to think about the ways that we connect the build grant investments in the Mullen area to the rest of the network. So this sort of gets to part of what Neva was asking in terms of the ways that we think about those connections and how people are traveling. So those are a few highlights from enhanced connections. And I think this is always a nice point to just do a quick flip back and forth between new connections and enhanced. So again, we're looking at enhanced connections right now, and then I'm just going to flip back to new connections. So right away, you can see a difference in terms of the number of projects, the types of projects. And again, a lot of that is that some of the major projects in new connections, like that Russell Street extension, are really big and really expensive projects. So that's part of the difference. So then our last scenario, you'll see some similarities to enhanced connections, but this one is called regional equity. And our focus in the regional equity scenario was a little bit different than enhanced connections. So what we did for this scenario is we weighted our project scoring to focus in on all of the criteria related to our equity goals. And we also focused on projects in Invest Health neighborhoods. So Franklin to Fort, North and West Side. Oh my gosh, I just blanked on the last neighborhood, and River Road as the three key Invest Health areas. So we really focused on projects that are not only in those areas, but that also help to connect neighborhoods and connect people to jobs and schools and other opportunities. This scenario focuses on a lot of very affordable projects. And so those are lower cost projects that can really help connect people to transit and to walking and biking as very affordable transportation options. So a few projects that I will highlight here, you will see some trail extensions and some trail improvements included in this scenario. So we've got the Milwaukee Trail extension. We have lighting improvements on the Bitterroot Trail. There are a handful of key complete streets projects included here, such as the Howard Razor Avenue Complete Street, so really a key connection to the North Side neighborhood. And then you'll see, a handful of similar investments that we've seen in terms of downtown. But what might jump out to you as you look at this is the fact that you do see some connections further out in the region. Again, very much focused on active transportation connections, but with some complete streets as well. And then a lot more connectivity between neighborhoods. So I'll give you the quick flip between regional equity that we're looking at here, and then back to enhanced connections. So you can see the focus is just a little bit different in terms of the areas that are slated for projects in this scenario. So those are the 3 scenarios. And I think before we jump into the nuts and bolts of how they performed, I'll pause for just a second and see if anybody's got questions about those 3 scenarios or how we shaped them. Anyone need clarification? Okay. Erin, did I miss anything major on those 3?
I don't think so. That was
Okay.
great.
All right, well, let's move on to how they perform. So often, as Erin and I have started having conversations with folks about the scenarios, some people gravitate immediately toward one or the other. Other folks are like, well, I like this about this one and this about another. So we are going to ask you for your thoughts about how you think these scenarios meet your needs, meet the needs of the community as we move forward. But we'll give you just a quick look at some of the analysis we've done to understand how they perform. So don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through the results of all 15 plus metrics that are shown here, but this is just a quick graphic to show you as we look at the 5 goals that Erin showed at the beginning, we evaluated each of these scenarios against more than 15 different metrics. So we looked at how each of the scenarios might improve safety, the types of access that the scenarios might give people, both in terms of accessibility, so for people with disabilities, but also really in terms of access to places, to jobs, to schools, to parks, to social services. We looked at affordability in terms of the types of travel options for people and also affordable housing. And we really looked at connectivity, equity, and the ability to support growth. And so in the examples of some of the analysis we're going to show you tonight, we're going to focus on this 4th goal around connect and strengthen communities and give you a snapshot of some of the equity, affordability, and support for growth analyses that we did. What you're seeing though at a quick look at this overall chart is the color ramp that we're using here is the lighter blue is showing you how each scenario performed relative to those different metrics and maybe a little bit less supportive. And that ramps up to orange being the most supportive. So as you're just kind of quickly looking at this, when you see the darker colors and the orange colors, that scenario is doing a little bit more toward achieving the goals. But one of the things that you'll see as we go through is that each scenario is advancing our goals. That's the good news in all of this. They all move us in the right direction, but they do it in really different ways. And so that's where some of the trade-offs that Erin was talking about earlier come into play. So we'll start with a quick look at affordability. And this, we use several different kinds of analysis as we moved through all of this. We use the regional travel demand model, which is really good at assessing how future networks perform for people driving. So it's really good at looking at vehicles and vehicle trips, and it's also really good at looking at big projects. But a regional travel demand model is not great at assessing the ways that active transportation projects and transit projects change people's behavior. So we did a lot of analysis that was outside of the model. And some of that analysis was just really simple, just some basic overlays to understand things like affordability. So this particular analysis that we're looking at looks at the ways that the different transportation networks help connect to affordable housing sites. And so all of the little dots that you see on this map, all the little green dots, are locations where in 2018 there was affordable housing. And we defined affordable housing as developments that receive low-income housing tax credits, HUD funding, so Housing and Urban Development Funds, or Section 8 funding, as well as mobile home courts. And then we identified how each of the transportation networks, and we're looking at regional equity here, how each of those networks, how close it came to those affordable housing locations. And that's what you can see in the little table here on the left. you can see that the regional equity scenario serves 128 different affordable housing locations. So that means that projects within that scenario come within 200 meters of an affordable housing site. And again, this is one way to think about how much connectivity we're starting to offer with the different scenarios. Enhanced Connections performs pretty well on this measure. And then New Connections provides a bit less connectivity to affordable housing sites, and some of that is about the number of projects that are included, of course. So that's a look at affordability. And then support for growth. So there's a few different elements included in this analysis. The map that we're looking at here, just so everybody knows, is the enhanced connections scenario. So we tried to give you a couple of different examples here. The blue shaded areas that you're looking at, so we took the strategic growth scenario and we mapped the transportation analysis zones that are estimated to have more than 5 dwelling units per acre in 2050. So you see areas like Mullen pop up, you see a lot of different areas both in downtown and some of the inner neighborhoods that are anticipated in the strategic growth scenario to have a bit more density. And so that ties us back to what Aaron presented early on. So what we see when we overlay the transportation networks is that the enhanced connections and the regional equity networks in particular really provide better coverage, which means they're providing more support for growth, especially in a lot of these inner areas, and have more projects overall. So that's a benefit in terms of the ways that the different transportation networks could help to support growth. It's important that, because all of the scenarios do include the build projects, do include a lot of projects that are near the Mullen Area Master Plan, they all support that planned growth as well. But there is a lot of thought in the connectivity for the enhanced connections scenario, especially related to some of these inward areas of growth. So that's a snapshot of support for growth. And then the last piece that I'll talk about in detail is related to equity and some of the analysis that we did here. So there are two different pieces that you're seeing on the map. The red areas that are highlighted are areas where there is a concentration of folks who fit a lot of demographic or socioeconomic profiles. So those areas in red are places that have concentrations of densities of people with disabilities, of young folks, so people under the age of 17, older adults over 65, lower English proficiency or lower English speaking households, zero car households, people of color, and a median income at or below the federal poverty level. So there's a lot of different variables that were coming together to shape those areas. And then also just recognizing the investments that are needed and that are being made in the Invest Health neighborhoods. We included those neighborhoods which are shown in purple as part of our equity analysis. So what we tried to assess here are the ways that we might expect people's travel behavior to change in these areas in particular. And part of the reason for doing that was, again, really trying to understand, are we providing affordable transportation options for people? Are we providing connections for people to the places that they need to go? And there are a few key things that we found here. So the enhanced connections and the regional equity scenarios both decreased the percentage of trips that people made by driving within the Invest Health neighborhoods and these equity zones. You could think about that and say, well, wait a second, does that mean you're depressing the number of trips that people make? And it doesn't. The modeling actually holds the number of trips constant. It just means that people are able to shift their trips to walking or biking or transit. And so part of what that tells us is that in these areas in particular, we're providing more options for people and we're providing more affordable travel options for people. So the regional equity scenario, we saw the greatest increase in the percentage of walking trips. And then in the enhanced connections scenario, we saw the greatest increase in the percentage of biking trips. And when you think back to those scenarios and some of the projects that we highlighted, it starts to make sense. The enhanced connections and regional equity scenarios both have more projects. They have more walking and biking projects. They have more neighborhood greenway projects. So lower speed residential streets that are improved for people walking and biking. And so we did see that play out in the analysis, which was good, and differently than we saw it play out in the neighborhoods that are even just adjacent to these areas. So that tells us that some of those investments that are really focused on equity do have the potential to provide more affordable travel options for people. So just to bring that all back together, I'll give you a simpler version of the graphic here and highlight a couple other things. Again, as we mentioned, each of the scenarios does help to move us toward our goals. And you can see that they do that in very different ways. The enhanced connections is really strong in terms of connectivity and safety, but new connections actually is also really strong in terms of the ways that it enhances connectivity. It enhances connectivity a little bit more multimodally and also for freight, whereas enhanced connections really strengthens bike connectivity. So they achieve these goals in slightly different ways. Another important thing that we found, and this ties back to the land use scenarios that Erin shared at the beginning, all three of the transportation networks, we see more positive benefit toward our goals when we talk about these three networks with a strategic growth scenario. So when we are more intentional about how we grow and in programming growth in areas that really have the capacity for it and that are a bit more inward focused, these transportation scenarios start to perform better. That is especially true around connectivity and accessibility, because we have more people that are closer to more jobs, to more schools, to more services. It is also especially true on the equity and affordability measures. Again, sort of for the same reason, we have more people who are closer to more things. And then importantly, and this is the last piece of the analysis that I'll mention for tonight, it also relates in terms of vehicle miles traveled. So when we look ahead to 2050, if we didn't make any of these investments in terms of the transportation networks and we just grew as we were planned, we obviously see an increase in vehicle miles traveled from what we have today. More people, same transportation network, you're going to see vehicle miles traveled go up. But with any of the three transportation network scenarios, and then particularly with strategic growth, we see vehicle miles traveled go down compared to that 2050 base. And so that's a good story. That's what we would exactly hope to see by making these kinds of transportation investments. We also see walking, biking, and transit trips go up. So again, it's not that people have lost the ability to make trips, it's simply that they have the ability to make them in different ways. And then we also see greenhouse gas emissions start to decrease across the board, which again is critically important in terms of the region's climate goals and plays out in a lot of different ways. So that is a tremendous amount of information. One thing I will mention before we open it up for some discussion is that in addition to all the information that's on the website, we did create just a very simple interactive map, which also links on the website, gives you the ability to turn the scenarios on and off and to click on individual projects to understand a little bit more about the type of improvement that is being considered as part of that scenario. So that's a helpful tool as you want to dig in a little bit more. So we would love to hear from you. And these are questions that we're going to be asking the public over the next month. We'd love to hear any comments, thoughts, or overall impressions about the scenarios. And then if you've got preferences between them or for one of them or another. And then also for those of you who maybe have a specific project in mind or something that is really important to you, did we capture it and what is really most important that we focus on moving forward? So I will open it up for some feedback from all of you and happy to answer questions as we go through that.
Great, thanks a lot, Jennifer and Erin. That was really a really comprehensive presentation. I think that the analysis is really strong. That's my perspective. let me try and switch the view here. I guess we can use the new system, I guess, for this with raising your hand in our new Zoom format. If folks have questions, why don't we go ahead and do it that way? Could I ask some clarifying questions to start? I mean, I'd like to respond to the questions you want here, but a few things that I picked up on. First of all, was there a project on 93 that I note on Highway 93 north of the Y? It looked like a dark line in a lot of the scenarios.
Yep, that's an MDT project that's currently in the MPO. It's receiving federal funds, so it's in our transportation improvement program. It's I think it's a widening and resurfacing, adding a center turn lane sort of through that section of Highway 93 where there isn't one. So that's partially a safety and just roadway improvement project that MDT has had programmed for a number of years.
Great, thanks. And Jennifer, at the end there, you said that the VMT was reduced in all the scenarios. Is that in real terms over this time period, or is it normalized for population?
It is. So it is normalized for population because we are comparing it against the 2050 base. So it assumes we have grown to 2050 levels and then adds the transportation network scenarios on top of that. So it is accounting for that future growth and is a decrease from what that 2050 future would look like with no action.
Okay, I see. Yeah, so it's based on if we made no investments.
Exactly.
No investments in transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And my last question, on one of the slides there, you showed like access that the scenarios would provide to places where there was residential density over 5 units per acre.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this one was curious to me because I don't know if you can speak to this. You might not be able to, but it was surprising to me not see more of the Mullen area, master plan area in this, and to see the area sort of east of England Boulevard, roughly, or I don't know what that north-south
See this
road
jump
is.
out.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like having transit supportive densities was a big focus of the Mullen area master plan. Does this include the proposed densities in that project or not, or something else going on there?
It should, but I'm not sure why it's not. That's a really good point. I think I was noticing the same thing, and I think we need to look at that. Something's not showing up there because we did look at, in the strategic growth, we did look at maximizing sort of the full build out potential of the Mullen area master plan. And I know the overall densities in that were higher than 5 dwelling units per acre, at least in certain pockets of that. But it might also be how, we're in the model, when we're allocating households in the model, sometimes those TAZs are a larger area. And so you might be
exactly right,
getting those densities in locations, but then not seeing it over sort of the larger area, if that makes sense.
Aaron, that is exactly what I think is going on, because when we were looking at the growth map earlier, we're looking at the UFTAs, right, which is a different footprint. And when we look at the TAZs, it's really spreading the density across the TAZs in ways that can sort of skew what you're seeing. And so I think we're picking up some of the Mullen area density kind of on the edges here based on where the TAZs are. But we'll double check that, Vince, just to be sure that that is really what's going on.
And I think that, just as a clarification, when we do our future growth modeling, we're doing it from sort of the transportation perspective, and I think there are, we can always do better and more collaboration with land use planning and get those density maps and sort of future modeling of household growth. So it's something that I think we can always work on and do better as a community, and that's something we can. I'm sure we will, as growth policies get updated and we look at that data, that there will be more of that out there.
Great, thanks for the explanation. That makes sense. And I think, like I said at the beginning, this was a great effort along those lines in that direction, Aaron. I think I think this is really useful information to have. So Caroline, you have your hand raised. Please take the floor.
Yes, well, you stole one of my questions, Vince. So thank you for asking that about Mullen. And thank you for this presentation. I'm so excited to delve into the scenarios, and I'm a total map nerd, so I'm really excited to toggle back and forth. One question about the maps. Is there a way to see projects that are included in multiple scenarios other than just toggling back and forth, or is that something we can click on the website? Okay.
Yeah, on the interactive map, so you can do all of the toggling, but then when you click on each individual project, it will tell you which scenarios it's included in. So you can actually, if you pop up a line, it'll say included in enhanced connections and regional equity.
Okay, great. And then, yeah, just so much information in this presentation. So my apologies if you've covered this, but could you contextualize this a little bit more with our mode split goals? I know that they reduce the single occupancy vehicles, but yeah, just any other context you could provide on that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Really good question, and I should have hit on that a little bit. So the Missoula region does have really aggressive mode split goals that were set in the last long range transportation plan, and we did not change those goals through this plan. We felt like we're a good ways from hitting them, and so what we need to do through this long range plan is continue to make progress. So the good news is that all three of the transportation scenarios do move us toward those mode split goals. None of them with this limited level of investment get us there. And we talked a lot about this with a couple of different committees, and there was some interest in some of our committees in seeing a completely unconstrained scenario that would get us to our mode share goals. Part of what Aaron and the team and I have continued to talk about is that infrastructure investments alone aren't going to do it. We could spend 5 times the amount of money that we have available or that we think would be available, and we're still not going to hit our mode split goals without some policy and programmatic actions that really incentivize or disincentivize certain types of behavior. So that's when we start to think about the ways that pricing comes into play, the ways that transportation demand management, certainly the land use and growth pieces become even more important when we talk about how to hit those mode split goals. So these scenarios move us in the right direction. Strategic growth moves us even further in that direction, but we don't fully get there through this level of investment.
That all makes sense. Thank you for that.
Toon.
Yeah, I apologize if these are for the kind of newbie questions here, but one question I had with respect to the model was, is there any variability with different neighborhoods and different geographic areas in terms of their adoption of public transportation? In terms of, like, again, just usage, if people in some areas are less inclined to use public transportation? And then a second question I have is, does your group take into account, or where does parking come into play? Is this part of your planning as well, or is that kind of ancillary?
Aaron, do you want me to start, or you want to go ahead?
Well, I'll tackle the parking one first, because maybe that's the easy question. Well, sort of easy. That the long range transportation plan and the modeling per se doesn't really factor. There's a little bit of, I think, parking wrapped into that, but not in a. We're not messing with parking levels and seeing how that affects travel patterns. It's just that it's sort of something the model isn't very good at, or the capacity to do that. But we do know that one of the biggest factors on whether people drive or not is the availability of parking. And we also know that parking affects all sorts of other things like housing affordability and densities and the urban landscape. And so it is sort of, parking is one of those things that's essential and critical to all of the things that we're working on, but it's not necessarily part of the infrastructure investments and modeling and evaluation. But when it comes to Caroline's question about mode split goals, parking is going to be one of those key pieces that is going to affect that, if that makes sense. Does that answer that part of your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And then in terms of the other piece of your question related to, it sort of gets to people's propensity to use transit and then also the behavior aspect of transportation. And the regional travel demand model is not good at that, which is part of the reason that we did a lot of these off-model analyses. So the regional travel demand model really follows the Missoula region model, uses what is called the traditional 4-step process, and it focuses on destinations that are going to generate trips, the assignment of those trips to the routes that are available, and doesn't get as much into choice as somebody does when they're typically making a decision. So that's just a shortcoming with a regional travel demand model. It's not anything that is specific to Missoula. It is part of the reason, though, that we did also look at the equity analysis and the Invest Health neighborhoods, because when we think about the demographic characteristics that we were factoring in and the socioeconomic characteristics we're factoring in, those are populations that are typically more likely to use transit. So that was a way to start to understand where there might be a propensity for transit, but then also want to recognize that, service availability, where is transit service? What's the span of service? How long does it run? How frequently does it run? How comfortable is that experience is also a huge piece. So those are things that the model doesn't do, but we did try and get at a little bit of that through some of these other analyses.
Yeah, and I think we will get better and better information over time, partially because Mountain Line is doing such a good job of pushing transit, and we're sort of seeing what those investments, what outcomes. So, perfect example of the moving to 15-minute service and zero fare, transit ridership almost doubled within 3 years. So that's a really clear indication that if you provide frequent service and you make it accessible to people, that they'll ride transit. And so now we'll see what happens when we expand sort of scope of services to evenings and weekends. And Vince, you could probably talk about more about this than we can, but we'll see the effect of that in those neighborhoods, or increasing frequency on existing routes. And then that will tell us, so when we go to do our next update in 4 or 5 years, we'll have a much better idea of, if we make this investment, we're going to get this kind of ridership. And so we can sort of at least make some good assumptions about what that will look like in the future. Whether or not the model says this is exactly what's going to happen, we can have some assurance that we'll get some benefit out of that.
Great, thank you.
Aaron and Jennifer, I think you covered that quite well. I don't have much to add from the transit perspective there. I think that's right on, but I do have another question that came up for me as I was listening. I might have missed it, and I apologize if I did, but were there results of the analysis that compared the two growth scenarios at any point? And if not, or could you speak to that? I mean, I think the in particular, any results or conclusions you have regarding those two scenarios would be pretty useful for the planning board.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't pull out specific results from that we shared on a separate slide tonight, Vince, and part of that is just that we recognize it's a lot of information. We talked about it just a little bit, and I think there are a couple of key points that I would reiterate, and then Aaron certainly jump in. So for any of the transportation networks, how you're seeing their performance on this slide, so the darker blue and the orange showing better performance toward the goals, moving towards strategic growth as opposed to business as usual just amplifies those benefits. So the outcomes with the strategic growth scenario layered on were more positive across the board. And that was especially true when we looked at the connectivity and accessibility goals, because we're putting more people near more places that they want to go and being able to provide better access to those places. It was also especially true related to the equity and affordability. So again, having more people who are able to be served by more affordable modes. And then particularly, related to vehicle miles traveled, we see a greater decrease in vehicle miles traveled with strategic growth than we do business as usual. And that translates into further reductions of greenhouse gas emissions as well. So we really started to talk about strategic growth as kind of an amplifier, as opposed to doing a whole set of separate analysis.
That makes sense. So the effect was in one direction and it was pronounced in all the different investment scenarios.
Yep, consistent across the board.
Okay. Shane, you've got your hand raised.
Sure. I guess maybe just to piggyback on that and maybe get to the questions that you guys asked of us. When you go as an amplification, did it change the results of, like what was the best case scenario, like what was better, or did everything just better, but regional priority or regional equity and enhanced connections didn't necessarily didn't flip-flop which one was better? Like everything just got a little bit better across the board. Is that right?
It was pretty linear. It really was. Okay. Yeah. There, in some cases, the differences in like the numeric differences might have shifted a tiny bit, but those differences were so small that we didn't find them to be statistically significant. They weren't meaningful shifts of like 0.01% of something. So generally I would say it was really linear across the board. Aaron, can you think of any examples where that wasn't the case?
I don't think so. I think you're right. It really did amplify, and it makes sense, I think, on an intuitive level that, if you put more people in closer proximity to jobs and services and existing infrastructure, that you get more benefit out of that. I mean, there's maybe a value wrapped up in that we didn't want to try to, in terms of like, do people want higher density or more focused inward growth is not a question that we tried to answer, but we wanted to show the effect of that. And I think it was pretty clear across the board that we get a more efficient transportation system if you focus more growth inward. And again, I think part of that is that the jobs are following the households to some extent when we do these growth scenarios. And so you have the more households you're moving into the core, there's more jobs in there as well. And again, that's all based on existing zoning and where jobs are allowable. And there's some limitations on the modeling in terms of what kinds of jobs and all of that we could go into detail if you really wanted to talk about models. But generally speaking, I think that hopefully makes intuitive sense that you more compact development and more focused on the core creates a more efficient transportation system.
Sure. I mean, it makes total sense. So I guess with that being said, I just wanted to visit your questions that you posed to the group here. I mean, I thought my overall impression was of the scenarios. I thought, it seemed really well thought out from small compact scale to, big regional scale. So I had a really positive impression. I'm leaning towards the regional equity in my own mind. It seemed to check more of the boxes for me, although I hate to see the greenhouse gas emissions in the column that I maybe liked the least. That's that would be one of my top priorities. But and then maybe the last piece I wanted to hit on was a question about we heard a zoning request change in Grant Creek a few months ago, and it got denied for a number of reasons. I think one of which was some traffic related study issues, and wondering if that has come up in your guys on your radar to see if there's any enhancements in that area. I know that one of your slides suggested that you were focusing or shifting focus away from Grant Creek and a few other areas. The area that had come up seemed ripe for growth in terms of land area, but the transportation network was lacking. And is that an area where you could lead by thinking about a comprehensive transportation plan and connection, and then that would potentially make development better?
Thank you for that, Shane. And I can address the greenhouse gas not question, but I'll just make a quick comment on that. And then Aaron, if you want to talk at all about Grant Creek, certainly chime in. So I will say that the good news across all three scenarios is that all three do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it's interesting that new connections is the one that has the greatest reduction there. And so we dug into that a little bit because we wanted to be sure that it made sense. And it really is in many ways a factor of the model and the outputs that we use to create that estimate. And so one of the things that it factors in, aside from reduction in vehicle miles traveled, is a reduction in delay. And because the new connections scenario includes some new connections and some new roadways, including that connection up to I-90, you do see some reductions in delay, and especially vehicle delay, in a few of those key areas. And so those greenhouse gas reduction effects are a little bit more localized than what we see in the other scenarios. So it's a good point. It's an important one to call out. I just don't want anybody thinking that the other scenarios all dramatically increase greenhouse gas emissions, because they don't.
Yeah, and the Grant Creek is an interesting question, and then I would maybe throw that back to this group as a question of, we in this scenario process, one of the things we're trying to get at is that there are trade-offs involved in how and where we make investments. And one of the things we were looking at that Jennifer put up is that, areas of current or future projected growth and where are we making investments to facilitate that. And I think it's worth spending some time really thinking about where those opportunities for growth are and how can we make transportation investments that accommodate all of them over the next 30 years or with the available funding. I don't know that we could. And so there's sort of a question for you all or from the land use side of where are those high priority areas that we want to make the transportation investments in so that we facilitate growth there. And so we're making intentional transportation investments to support growth in the places that we want to see it. That could be Grant Creek in that location. I mean, there are certainly transportation improvements we could make that increase connectivity and access to that site. But the question I would put back is that the location where you would want to prioritize those investments, or are there other investments that we could make elsewhere that maybe have different benefits or different trade-offs? And so it's not really an answer to your question, but I think that's how I would look at that, and the kind of feedback that would actually be really helpful for us when we're prioritizing projects so that we're getting the ones that will promote the growth where the community wants to see it.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, good. I think it's a really good point and worthy of discussion here, I think. And I guess the thing that, maybe this is me just putting my own thoughts on what I've heard from the board, but I think that we think that the Mullen Area Master Plan the master plan was done very well. It's worthy of growth. We think that it's a positive investment, but there's still a little bit of heartbreak about the fact that it is prime agricultural area that is going away. And so, it's been approved. We're moving on. It's worthy of investment. We want to make those connections. The Grant Creek subdivision or zoning request was different in that, it was in my mind, it was there was opposition to it, which is one thing, but it's not prime agricultural soil, and I think the board was a little mixed about it because it seemed like it was the type of land we want to develop on, being an existing gravel pit, but the connections weren't there. It didn't meet the other goals of the board, and if the other goals had checked the box, I would see that as being potentially a better place to develop than other options, and just maybe want to open that up for other discussion.
Josh, is your comment, is it in response to this, or will it take us in a new direction? here, because I want to give you a chance to speak.
Yes, it wasn't related to Shane's comment, but I could maybe address that and just, I would second what he said. I think that's an area where we would want development, but the existing transportation connections didn't exist to, I guess, outweigh that. They outweighed the location in my mind. So I ended up voting against it. But I would agree, if those connections existed, that would be a great place for, higher density type of development. So I guess my question, just a couple of quick questions. A lot of them have already been asked, so that was great. Does the model consider any advancements in travel technology that we will certainly make between now and, or hopefully make between now and 2050? Electric vehicles, hydrogen, any other advancements that may be, on the horizon, hopefully? And then the other one was, how do you guys see each of these scenarios impacting how and where we grow? And do you see them acting as one, maybe act as more or less of a catalyst to our strategic growth initiative and spurring more infill? And then the last question is, does this take into account or make any predictions about impact on real estate values?
I'll take that last question first. No. It does not. But it is an important consideration as we do move from 3 scenarios into a recommended scenario and think about the challenges with affordability in the region. It's one thing to say that we're enhancing affordability by increasing connectivity, but we also understand that with increased connectivity and access comes gentrification in many cases. It comes increasing home prices come with that and increasing rents. So it is absolutely an externality that needs to be considered as we move into the recommendations for the plan. So I'll jump back to your first question really quickly, Josh, and address the question about changing technologies and what the model accounts for. So the regional travel demand model itself doesn't necessarily focus on changes in technology, and both what that means for people's travel behavior, but then also what it means for something like greenhouse gas emissions. As part of the analysis that we did for greenhouse gas emissions was outside of the model. We took some model outputs and we did build in some assumptions about an increase in the percentage of electric vehicles, but stayed pretty conservative with that for this first analysis. When we have a recommended scenario, we will do a much more detailed climate assessment as part of that. And that does include a little bit more focus on technologies, even just beyond electric vehicles. But it's a pretty gross estimate at this point that probably doesn't go as far as the region might actually get. And then Aaron, I will let you tackle the question about, so the middle question that I think was related to, does one of these scenarios do more than another to support growth? And I have an opinion on that, but Aaron, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, but it's interesting to see if our opinions are the same. I think they all can support growth in maybe different ways, which maybe isn't a satisfying answer, but one of the ways to think about it is when you start increasing density, but you don't have adequate multimodal transportation facilities, you're likely to get more traffic, and that isn't necessarily a good thing. So providing good, connected, well-defined multimodal transportation networks in the core can actually help facilitate that infill by giving people lots of different options, knowing that those trips are shorter and there's more capacity to maybe or willingness to take those by either walking or biking or taking transit. And so in that sense, I think, some scenarios will have more of a benefit in those areas. Like thinking about Franklin to the Fort, where, there's a lot of infill happening there. It's projected to be a higher density neighborhood. But if you don't have good sidewalks and bike connectivity and transit stops, people will drive, and that creates more traffic in that neighborhood, which is not what you want. And so those two things kind of have to go hand in hand. So that's where I would think about, each of these scenarios might do it in a slightly different way. But they're all accommodating growth to some extent, just maybe differently. I don't know. Is that how you were thinking of it, Jennifer, or you have a different opinion?
No, I think that's right. And, we've been really careful to try not to to highlight the differences between the scenarios, but allow folks to really see what works in them in slightly different ways. The one thing that I would say is in shaping the enhanced connection scenario, we were pretty intentional about connectivity between neighborhoods, including connectivity between some of the investments in the Mullen area and other parts of Missoula. And so that one in its design does a little bit more to support those sorts of neighborhood connections, and you might say support growth in some ways. But as Aaron mentioned, they each have their benefits in slightly different areas.
Aaron, the point you made about multimodal connectivity being important for high density areas, if in order to avoid a real big increase in vehicle trips that could overload the system. That was, for me at least, was one of the main issues with the project that Shane brought up at Grant Creek that the planning board denied. It was an area that turned out to be an area of residential high density in the city's growth policy. There's a few of those pockets in the approved growth policy that stand today. I guess my question for you guys, I think, is did you do an analysis or do you know if any of the scenarios provide multimodal connectivity to all the areas in the city and county growth policy that are recommended for high density? Because that's something that's come up for us. I mean, you mentioned earlier about planning board recommending where growth would occur. I mean, that's the case in some instances, like when we approve the county growth policy update, but for the most part, what we're doing is interpreting the existing growth policy of the city and county. So that's a really, I think, important question for us.
Yeah, I mean, in a basic sense, I don't think we overlaid the transportation network on high density land use designations from the growth policy. But
I think this is the closest we got, right, Aaron?
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, our growth projections are based on capacity of those areas, and so you're going to see higher densities in those higher density growth policy area. The areas that the growth policies designate as higher density, you'll see more growth there in our housing projections, just by the way that those households get allocated by existing capacity. It's a little bit of a technical detail, or sort of a technical look at it, but I do think it's a worthwhile question and something to look at maybe in more detail, or have that conversation and make sure that we're thinking about that enough. The other challenging piece is that we're limited on funding. This is a 30-year plan. Do we think that all of those high density areas are going to develop at this, within that 30-year time frame? So there's a bit of a timing aspect too, like where do we think we want to develop first, and then that's where we should prioritize transportation investments, because your investment sort of indicates your intent, and hopefully the development follows that, or at least that's I think in an ideal world maybe that's what happens. I don't know if that's always the case, or maybe rarely the case. Who knows? But I think that's how we want to start thinking strategically about these investments, and maybe there's a balance in terms of like, this area we know is developing and we know we have to serve it, there's existing issues, and then there are these other areas that we want to sort of foster development there because we know it can accommodate higher density and mix of uses and transportation options, and so balancing those two sides is maybe the right approach.
Yeah, that approach sounds right to me, Aaron. I mean, I think it's probably is worth a discussion, just because, I think the transportation investments that are planned to a large degree help actualize the vision in the growth policy. And we saw that with the Grant Creek proposal that we've discussed, where it was a proposed for high density in the growth policy, but it wasn't really backed up with existing or planned infrastructure, and that caused heartache among residents, and it was a disconnect. I think that the planning board ultimately saw. So. Yeah, so I mean, personally, and with reference, I think it's good to go back to those questions that you want to get answers from us on. Personally, it's a lot to take in for me to give too much strong preference right now on which scenario I prefer. But I will think about it personally. Does any planning board members have additional comments you'd like to make in reference to the questions that Aaron and Jennifer are interested in hearing from us on?
I maybe want to change my vote to enhanced connections.
Well, I will say, then just sort of as we're starting to wrap this up, maybe there is a ton of information here, and it can be a lot to absorb, and so we don't necessarily need to make a decision now. And this is something we could potentially come back to the planning board if there is time, and as we start to refine or looks like there's a direction we're headed in terms of a preferred scenario, and come back to some of these key questions about are we facilitating growth in the places that we want to, and take a more targeted look, or future meeting where maybe we get some more formal recommendations from planning board in terms of how you might recommend we adjust to facilitate that. But to give yourself some time to dig through all of this. We have a number of community meetings coming up with more targeted neighborhood groups. That's all on our website. We have there's a ton of information out there. We have a short survey that sort of walks through these scenarios and asks some of these kind of key questions that we're asking you, just to get general, which scenario do people prefer? What aspects of that are people drawn to? What components of scenarios do people really want to see ensure it's in the final recommended? So there's an opportunity to get some additional feedback. And then we will come back, or we will be taking all that information that we gather over the next couple of weeks, and trying to refine that into a preferred scenario that we'll bring back out to the community as we start to make our recommendations for what the final plan is going to look like. So that might be another opportunity to really take that hard look of, did we get it right? Are there changes that you all would recommend we make to that plan? So maybe take the next couple of weeks, go through all this material, and then we can think about another upcoming meeting where we have that focused conversation, if that sounds right.
Yeah, that sounds good, Aaron. Thanks. I think it's definitely worthy of picking up again at a future meeting, and for planning board members to take some time in between now and then to look at the plan and consider the types of things that we see from a development perspective and the plans that we consider. So thank you. Thank you, Aaron and Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and apologies to Montana and Melissa and Karen for taking up so much time tonight. Hopefully you all get out of here reasonably soon.
Yes, thank you all so much. Thanks for the great questions. Take care.
Yep, thanks.
Take care. Okay. Well, great, fantastic. So it is 9:30. How about we if folks want to take a 5-minute break, we'll kind of come back and pick up the next item in 5 minutes. All right, I think we've got almost everyone back here, and we'll pick back up our meeting. So the next item on the agenda tonight is an affordable housing special presentation from Montana James of the city and Melissa Gordon and Karen Hughes from the county.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see. Get it into presentation mode. All right. Do you see it in presentation mode?
Yep, it's looking good, Karen. Full screen.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. So I know that this has been an topic of some interest for the planning board. And so I talked with Melissa and Montana about providing an overview to the planning board. I know you've gotten a lot of information already tonight, and so we'll probably hit the high points and do our best not to overdo it. And if there's an opportunity where you'd like us to come back and have more of a conversation or learn something about something in more depth, I'm sure that we could accommodate that. But we'll just give you kind of a blush of, or we'll brush over kind of what both the city and the county are doing in terms of affordable housing. So first of all, I'm Karen Hughes. I'm the Assistant Director of Community and Planning Services for the county, and our office includes not only the planning side, which you see a lot of, but it also includes grants and community programs, which Melissa is part of, parks, trails, open lands, and sustainability. So we're a pretty diverse department. And I'll let maybe Melissa go next.
Hi, I'm Melissa Gordon, and I'm the Program Manager for the Grants and Community Programs Division of Community and Planning Services. So I get to work with Karen. Thanks for having us.
And Montana.
Good evening. It's good to be here. I'm Montana James. I'm the Community Development Manager in the city's newly formed Community Planning, Development, and Innovation.
All right, so tonight we'll talk a little bit about the city's efforts. You're pretty familiar with the city's housing policy probably, and Montana has updates on their implementation and next steps. We'll talk a little bit about what the county's been doing. We have a number of efforts that we have worked on for years, but then we also have some exciting new efforts coming up here. And then we'll open it for questions. And with that, I will let Montana take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So yeah, as Karen said, I know this group is pretty familiar with the city's housing policy, and we've been here before you in the past to talk about the policy. I think it's been about a year now since we have touched on this topic, though, and it has been quite a year. So as a brief reminder, the city's housing policy was passed in 2019, and it contains just over 24 specific policy recommendations aimed to improve housing affordability in Missoula. In the policy, we break down the recommendations into sort of 4 strategy areas. Those are, the first one is track and analyze progress for continuous improvement. The second is align and leverage existing funding resources to support housing. The third is reduce barriers to new supply and promote access to affordable homes. And the last is partner to create and preserve dedicated affordable homes. And so kind of moving from the policy adopted in 2019 to the implementation, we crafted a 3 to 5 year implementation timeline. And we've broken that into different steps and categories. Those are kind of more focused on activities addressing funding in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which has a lot of elements and kind of infrastructure steps to set up. Activities that have to be handled through our land use code, Then there are some activities that require specific program development, either by our city staff in the Community Development Division or through partnerships with other organizations in the community. And then there are also several activities that have to occur through public-private partnerships, especially related to financing and our community development financial institutions and some of those pieces. So we're posting regular updates on our Engage Missoula housing policy page, which now is pretty far down the list of Engage Missoula projects, but it's still there. So we're trying to keep that as up to date as possible on any new developments. So to date, we have really focused our implementation on the funding recommendations and the code recommendations, because those are both sort of kind of first steps that we have to get through in order to get to the programmatic and financial pieces. So establishing the Affordable Housing Trust Fund was a top priority because it is, like I said, the backbone for most of those programmatic pieces. And we adopted the Affordable Housing Trust Fund ordinance and an accompanying resolution that speaks to the city's commitment to funding the trust fund. Those were adopted in June of this year. And many of the other recommendations that we've prioritized have been more code related. We've worked a lot this year on incorporating the accessory dwelling unit updates in our Title 20 zoning code updates. Those were passed in October and I know came through this body. We've also done additional research into accessory dwelling units and participated in the Invest Health ADU convening this fall to just kind of get more up to date on current practice and the wide range of financing tools out there and kind of where folks are innovating in that realm. The city has also been working on a review of townhome exemption and subdivision regulations that our team has been involved with in a work group capacity. And that report was presented to City Council on the 18th of November, and I know came through this group as well. And so that has been finalized, and we're really looking forward to the next steps in implementation. And we've also been engaging in things like the long range transportation plan and the Mullen area master planning to do kind of to make sure we're looking holistically at the housing policy recommendations in concert with all of these other planning efforts. So as I mentioned, many of the recommendations in housing policy related to financing tools and innovation really rely on partner organizations. So in January of this year, we convened a public-private housing finance work group to start tackling some of those issues and start to have some of those conversations. And that group met about 4 times and we made some good progress, but COVID really affected and I think has changed the work and priorities for a lot of our partners in that work. So in May, we decided to pause that group and we hope to pick it up in 2021. And then finally, we continue to support several specific projects to meet the housing policy goals and kind of build our pipeline of affordable homes coming online in Missoula. We're working to negotiate the developer agreement for the 4th Street condo project, which includes 20% of the for sale units at an affordable rate. So it's about 7 homes. That will be for sale at prices that Missoulians making up to 120% of area median income can afford. And through our federal grant funding, we've supported and been working closely on the Trinity Housing Project, which is a split site on Cooley and Mullen, as well as the Villaggio Project. And we've also supported preservation of community land trust homes at Clark Fort Commons by supporting the re-roofing of their buildings and some homeowner rehabilitation programs through the Human Resource Council as well. So I think each of these projects, like I said, really help to build the pipeline and help us to craft and pilot some of the program elements that are recommended in the housing policy that will be more kind of sketched out and designed after the trust fund is up and running. So our focus as we head into 2021 and the remaining half of our fiscal year is to really continue to build that infrastructure necessary to get the trust fund operational. Our Affordable Housing Trust Fund Administrator, Emily Harris Shears, joined our team at the end of October, and she has really hit the ground running and has been working to seat the Citizen Oversight Committee that was called for in the Trust Fund Ordinance. There was a lot of City Council and community interest in that body, so we're prioritizing that work. And then we'll be working to develop the administrative policies and procedures that will guide that fund. Those will be probably a very long, detailed document that will also involve a lot of community input and partner input on. And then we will commission a housing assessment report to help the committee, the oversight committee, and staff really understand the landscape where we are now and guide priorities. You might be hearing my dog groaning in the background. I apologize for that. Then we'll develop an annual allocation plan and pilot the award cycle for the Housing Trust Fund. And the plan is to sync that up with our Community Development Block Grant and Home Grant cycle in January of 2022 with a unified application. And I did want to mention to this group that Emily, our Affordable Housing Trust Fund Administrator, will be hosting a community meeting via Zoom on January 6th at 6 p.m. To provide an update to the community on the work that she's doing. And lastly, in the realm of code-related recommendations, we're really eager to proceed with next steps from the subdivision and TED regulation review report, as I mentioned. That report recommends pursuing a unified development code, among other things. And I think through some of those processes, a lot of our code-related recommendations in the housing policy can be involved or implemented through some of those processes. And we do, as I mentioned, plan to reconvene our housing finance work group to continue to have conversations about how we can innovate in the housing finance realm. And based on the housing trust fund cycle and reporting, we'll then move towards kind of prioritizing the program development that I mentioned. And of course, we're going to continue to work closely with the county and staff as you proceed through all of the housing work that's happening on that end of things as well. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Montana. I can speak to the work that the Grants and Community Programs Division is doing on affordable housing, and then Karen will also talk about the planning side of things to give you the whole picture of how the county is addressing affordable housing. So in Grants and Community Programs, we focus pretty narrowly on creating housing opportunities for folks who are low to moderate income. And that's defined as 80% of the area median income or less. And that is because we get most of our funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, either through the Community Development Block Grant Program, or the Home Program, or the Continuum of Care Program, or the Brownfields Program. So I'll just run through the list of current grants that we have applied to the state or the federal government for that are supporting affordable housing efforts in the county. So we received a $450,000 CDBG grant from the state of Montana to help support the construction of the Meadowlark Housing Project. That's the new YWCA facility that's on 3rd Street, and that will be a housing and shelter facility that will enable them to double their capacity to serve homeless families. We also have a $200,000 CDBG housing rehabilitation grant, and that is for the rehab of homes owned by low to moderate income households inside of Missoula County, but outside of the city limits. And we partner with the Human Resource Council on that program. We also, as the county, have supported the Trinity Housing Project, first by donating land for the project site. And then secondly, we were able to take a portion of our county and tribal matching grant funds and funnel some money to support the construction of the navigation center that will be a part of that project. We also, on an annual basis, apply to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for Continuum of Care grants and have been successful in getting those grants every year to support the YWCA's Rapid Rehousing Program. And we recently received a $300,000 brownfield grant from the EPA. And with that brownfield grant, we'll be able to complete assessments on contaminated properties, and that may eventually lead to the development of housing. We also manage a whole lot of county funding, and a little over $500,000 of the funds that we manage goes to support shelter and housing programs for low-income folks, and that's primarily through the Community Assistance Fund and the Financial Administration Fund. And then this past spring, the commissioners created a special fund in response to housing needs due to COVID-19. And through this Emergency Rental Assistance Fund, we were able to provide 95 households with $500 in rental assistance. The commission also created a separate $100,000 COVID-19 relief fund, and of the $100,000, $34,500 went to support programs that would house or keep people housed during the pandemic. We also recently completed phase 1 of the Buena Vista Wastewater Improvement Project, and we were able to acquire $465,000 in grants to support the development of a replacement sewer system for that resident-owned community, and that enabled 35 households to stay in their affordable housing units. And we have a new partnership with Trust Montana. We had some program income funds from a first-time home buyer down payment assistance program that went back to the early 90s. And we have shifted the use of those funds still to provide support for first-time home buyers, but we're partnering with Trust Montana to implement a community land trust model. So those homes will be permanently affordable, and the homeowners will be getting support for the purchase of the home, and Trust Montana will own and manage the land under the home. And then finally, every year we conduct a community needs assessment, and that's something that's mandated in order for us to be able to apply for HUD funding. And the main point there is that every single year, affordable housing is the top priority for folks. So I'm really excited about some of the new efforts that the county is going to implement in the near future. And I will turn it over to Karen.
So we also do a number of activities more in the realm of land use planning and policy that we intend to help support opportunities for development of housing that meets our community's needs, including those of working families, vulnerable populations, etc., in addition to subsidized housing. And most of these are things that the planning board's been involved with, so they should look familiar. The Missoula area land use element was the update to the land use map for the growth policy that focused on the urban area. And that was adopted in the spring of 2019. And really, since 80% of the county's growth happens in that area, that was why that was prioritized, just to make sure that we were focusing on the area, doing really good planning that is grounded in our community's values, and among those values includes housing affordability to try and meet our community's growth needs. So that was one major project. The Missoula or the Mullen Build grant was another project that the both grants and planning staff worked to help support the efforts to get that grant funding to build the backbone infrastructure that can help support development in that anticipated growth area that's now being covered by the Mullen Area Master Plan. And again, that was both the Build grant and the Mullen Area Master Plan were implementation elements of that land use element. And again, the goal being to plan for and then provide infrastructure backbone to accommodate a significant amount of the community's growth that would happen over the next 20 years or so. And within that, to make sure that we address a variety of housing needs, provide a number of housing types, provide opportunity. So you've seen all of those items. Another piece that you are familiar with, although you haven't seen it in a little while, is the county zoning code update, and that's also intended to implement the Missoula area land use element. And again, housing and affordability were identified as key issues to address when we did the audit, which was about a year ago. And in the coming months, after the first of the year, you'll start to see information about that project coming out in both in terms of the code update, as well as a zoning map update that would cover more or less the same area that was covered by the land use element. So making sure that we're planning and providing opportunities for the kind of growth and development that we need to make sure people have good housing is part of our mission. I'm going to flip it back to Melissa. We're going to go back and forth a little bit.
So next steps for grants and community programs, we will continue to acquire grants that support housing and homeless programs. And we will also continue to manage grants and funds that enable the county to support affordable housing development, housing rehab, homeless projects and programs, and public infrastructure development projects to enable housing development. And we will also continue to collaborate with a number of community groups and coalitions so that we are aware of the housing needs as they exist in the county.
And in terms of land use planning and policy, continuing to implement the Missoula area land use element and the growth policy, getting that Millennium Master Plan adopted and start working on the implementation, adopting the new county zoning regulations, as well as a new zoning map for the Missoula urban area. And then working with our partners, the city, and private developers to plan and prioritize infrastructure investment and development, which is a huge expense in the realm of housing development. We also anticipate, similar to the city, which you were going to be hearing about, growth policy review and revision in December. I think that's been pushed out a bit. We're also in the process of reviewing our growth policy for updates. And a big piece of that will be identifying key development trends, including those related to housing, and finishing the land use strategy to manage growth consistent with community values, particularly for the more rural areas of the county. And there will likely be other elements as well.
Okay, we have a couple of really exciting developments. One is that we currently have a request for proposals out for the development of an affordable housing strategy. Those proposals will be due later this month, and we are hoping to have a consultant in place by March of 2021, and they will be charged with developing a comprehensive approach to address affordable housing issues in Missoula County. And they will be generating a report that details their findings, recommendations, and action steps. And we are also going to be advertising, hopefully in the next week, for a new housing specialist position. Within the county, we've had positions where various parts and pieces of what they do have relation to affordable housing, but we have never had one person that focuses primarily on housing. So that's tremendously exciting. We also hope to have that person in place by March of 2021. And we are hoping that that position will take the plan that the consultant develops and we'll turn that into a housing program and policies for Missoula County. And we will have a focus on housing, providing housing for working families and vulnerable populations.
So with that, if there's any questions, we're happy to entertain those. I'm sure you're exhausted by now with all this, but you can also, you have Melissa and Montana's contact information, and you always know how to find me as well. The county's approach has been to kind of work with the city as much as we can, and as well as kind of flex our own, doing the work that we've been doing for years. But the goal for this new position and the new study is to kind of complement and what the city's already started, but then also find those new niches that the county needs. We cover more terrain, we cover different areas, and we have some additional needs out there. And so making sure that we're dealing with those as well. I will somehow stop sharing, figure it out.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very informative, and it's clear that it's a priority for both the city and the county right now. And it's great to see so much solid work being put into this issue. I've got a few questions myself, but I think I'll open up the floor to everyone else first. Are there any questions from planning board members? Go ahead.
Just curious if there had been any discussion or if any cooperatives exist with a good affordable housing choice in Missoula.
Like housing cooperatives?
Yeah, like where they don't actually own the real estate, but they own a share of whatever the equity structure is, and allows them to build equity over time. But
I know people are looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's one in the Bitterroot. I don't know if Montana or Melissa, have you heard of any housing cooperatives?
I'm not aware of any.
You know who was really interested in this was Bill Carey, a former county commissioner. He really wanted to do a senior housing cooperative. There is a senior housing cooperative in Hamilton,
right?
Riverside Crossing. That's, I think, one of the few examples in Montana of a housing cooperative.
Yeah, I know they've been successful. I think down in the Bitterroot, that was the seniors, it's been fairly successful, and so I don't know. I'm not very well versed in it, but have heard of them.
Yeah, it seems like a really interesting model. It seems like we're always like patching together a gazillion things to try and make each individual development fly one way or the other. But that one really, that one seems complicated, and it seems to be kind of a unique specialty niche that people have to figure out.
I think that's also kind of one of the reasons that the City Housing Trust Fund is important to our strategy, is to be able to, the city itself is not in the field of creating a housing cooperative, but if we have flexible local funding that can kind of spur that innovation, that is a key piece of our policy. So yeah, I'd be interested to learn more about the example in the Bitterroot and see if any other groups are looking at a similar model.
I'll go ahead and ask my question. As I've been reflecting on affordable housing and how it relates to the issues that we see at the planning board. And I think most of the time in the last several years, when we see rezonings come through before us, I think the planning board generally feels like we're contributing to a lot of your efforts and others to help address the supply issue in affordable housing, which makes a lot of sense, right? It's what we can do at the local government level. But the really challenging situations that have come up have been when rezonings are almost certain to result in the demolition of existing affordable housing and the displacement of people who live there and don't own the houses. And a lot of different situations have come up in this area. The 4th Street project you mentioned earlier was one where the question of well, what is actually existing affordable housing and how is it defined came up as an issue in that case. In other cases, we've had mobile home situations where people are being displaced. I'm curious how you guys think about this issue, and if any of the things you're doing are working to address it, and if you've made any changes or learned anything from recent cases that have come in the past year.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit, Vince. I think you're right that a lot of the cases that we've seen, there's so many nuances to each property and each situation that we've seen in the past. But displacement is definitely something that is a piece of the city's housing policy and something we've been thinking about. A lot of times it's not necessarily a situation where the city can say, no, you can't demolish that property, or, you know, telling a property owner what they can and cannot do. It's more of a matter of having the resources and the support that folks need when they're faced with that situation. So we have been doing some research on how other communities have addressed specifically mobile home displacement, but also larger issues of displacement. And that's another place where it comes back to the trust fund, is if, you know, when the Citizen Oversight Committee is constructed, is displacement going to be a program priority for them, where we're going to dedicate funding to support folks who are facing displacement. I think all of that is yet to be seen, but financial resources is a big way to support folks who are in that position. Other cities and counties that we've looked at have put in different regulations into place related to how much notice that you have to give a property owner has to give folks who are facing displacement, how much of a plan they have to be provided with that gives them resources like organizations that they can go to. So there are some kind of levers there. But I think from our perspective and what we've found, again, it's just a matter of connecting folks with resources and helping them plan in most cases where we're not able to, stop the displacement, I guess.
Great, thanks for that answer, Montana. Shane, you've raised your hand.
I can find my unmute button. So I guess my question is probably for Montana. And maybe this isn't fully defined yet, but I'm wondering to what extent the trust fund is maybe seeking to do micro investments with small property owners to maybe incentivize. You know, we've started to clear some of the some of the barriers to creating ADUs and things like that. Are there ways that there could be further incentive to these small micro investments that do create affordable housing in not creating an ADU to be used as a VRBO or something like that? Like, you know, the ADU regulatory things only go so far, but can we incentivize the building of them in a way that makes them affordable long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is definitely something that we're thinking about. The housing policy does talk about creating incentives to encourage construction of ADUs to rent to voucher holders, or to make sure that they're maintaining affordability. You're also right that we haven't really defined that yet. There are several kind of steps along the way to getting the trust fund up and running, and looking at the data and creating that allocation plan, which will speak to the program priorities of what it will fund. And again, in partnership with that Citizen Oversight Committee that will be formed. But it's definitely something on our radar, and that was part of the kind of ongoing research that we've been doing at a staff level, participating in these convenings around accessory dwelling units. And it has been really helpful to hear from other communities that have really focused on ADUs as a housing strategy, to hear kind of what programs they've developed, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. And I think we'll take a lot of that learning into our process as we get more towards that development.
Okay, last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you again, Karen, Montana, Melissa, for the presentation. Look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Okay, so moving on with our meeting. We do not have any committee reports, or rather, perhaps we do. Well, no, actually, none of our committee representatives are here, so there's no possibility for committee reports tonight. We don't have any new business. We'll move on to new business and referrals. The first item of which is the reappointment of Mr. Josh Schroeder to the Missoula Consolidated Planning Board. It looks like the Missoula Conservation District has reappointed Josh to serve, and Josh has presumably accepted. I'm glad, Josh, that you're willing to take another go at this. It's been great to have you. And so the planning board, we get to, or required to vote to approve the reappointment. So I would entertain any a motion to approve the reappointment, or anyone to speak on behalf of Josh and all the great things he's done here as well.
So moved.
Great. Is there a second?
Seconded.
Seconded by Shane, moved by Dave. All in favor of reappointing Josh Schroeder as the Conservation District appointee to the planning board, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? None opposed. Wonderful, Josh.
Thank you. It's taken a year for me to figure out just kind of what I'm doing here. So I appreciate the patience by everybody.
That's for sure, huh?
He's now on a roll.
Josh, is this an annual thing? I mean, maybe you could tell us what your relationship is with the Conservation Board. Are you a member of that, or?
I am. I'm just an associate supervisor, so I'm not an elected supervisor. Yeah, I was appointed. Okay. I think mostly so that they could have a representative on the planning board. It'd been a long time since they had been able to convince somebody, I think, to take it on. So I'm happy to do it, and I've learned a lot from all you folks over the last year. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, it's great to have you.
I think it might be for like a 3-year term. I'm not sure. I don't think this is an annual event, but.
Yeah, I think
thanks, Karen. That's what I was getting at. Yeah, I was wondering if this is an annual thing we're going to go through.
No, I think it has to do with the term. So I think he's good for a while.
Okay. Great. So the next item is the Transportation Policy Coordinating Committee, representative from the Planning Board. So with the resignation of Peter Benson, we've lost our representative on the Transportation Policy Coordinating Committee. And we need to appoint a new one for the remainder of this year and then into 2021. This is an annual thing, an annual position. I can give a little bit of background on what the commission is. The TPCC, as it's known, is the advisory body for the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which we heard about from Aaron Wilson earlier tonight. And that's the body that oversees, most importantly, the long-range transportation plan, as well as funding proposals that come from the long-range transportation plan. So that body is responsible, given responsibility at the federal level for approving all expenses of federal transportation funding in the Missoula region. So if you're at all interested in transportation projects and keeping on the pulse of transportation projects in the region, that's the place to be. And it would be a good opportunity to get involved there. The responsibility from the planning board perspective is simply to attend the TPCC meetings, which occur up to once a month, probably 10 times a year or so. I don't attend myself. I don't know how often they tend to cancel. I do know that business when they don't have business, they don't meet, and their meetings are often very short. So the responsibility would be to, if you'd like to do this position, would be to attend those meetings and then report back to us at our meetings and give an update on what occurred. So it's an important position, I think, in a lot of ways, to help reinforce that connection between transportation and the land use. So is anyone interested, potentially?
Vince, are you interested?
It's a good question, Shane. I'm certainly interested. It's actually not something I could do because I work for Mountain Line. Some of you might not know that, but I work for Mountain Line in my day job, and Mountain Line is often a funding recipient from the MPO. So it's just, I've considered in the past here, Shane, and it's just not something that I'd feel comfortable with, or anyone else I work with would really feels like it's the right thing to do. So I'm out.
That's what I wanted to know is you seem like the most in line with that realm. So I just wanted to check that box.
If there's no interest, we don't need to have a representative. We would just be losing that position. We actually, if Aaron's still there, maybe he could speak to that. I guess maybe one point I would add, I believe that the planning board representative is a voting member on the TPCC, Aaron, is that right?
Yeah, and planning board plays sort of a unspoken critical role in the MPO. The Missoula's planning board is designated as the official MPO, and then those responsibilities are essentially delegated. The decision-making responsibilities are delegated to TPCC. So it is, in my mind, it would be a real loss if there was no representative from planning board participating in TPCC. I mean, it's the regional transportation planning body. It's making decisions about federal funding, and it's representing the planning board as the official MPO, designated by the governor as the MPO. So it is a critical role, and there are a lot of decisions that get made there. So I think it's an important piece, and it would be good to have somebody from planning board attend.
Aaron, when are those meetings regularly held?
They are the third Tuesday from 1:30 to 3, or we have it blocked for an hour and a half, but we try our best to keep it to an hour or less, which clearly we failed tonight, but we're usually not that bad at presenting long meetings. So
Aaron, could you talk about who else is on the board maybe?
Yeah, so it's made up of, it really is sort of the decision makers. And so we have the mayor, city council representative, 2 county commissioners, a member of the Missoula Urban Transportation District Board, the MDT district administrator, and then we have a couple of non-voting members, a representative of the Air Quality Board, and I think that's it. There might be one other non-voting member that I'm forgetting, but it's a fairly small group, but a lot of good discussion happens there.
Sorry, Aaron, could you say again when the meetings are?
The third Tuesday of the month at 1:30. And under normal circumstance, like planning board, we usually hold those meetings in council chambers, but we've been doing it virtually, so we'll continue to do that until we can have in-person meetings.
Great. I'd say, if you're considering interest, but I guess are concerned about conflicting with someone else's interest. I mean, I think the responsibilities could be shared as well. So if you're at all interested, this would be the time just to express your interest, and we'll figure out representation from there.
I'm not concerned with conflicting with anyone else's interests since I haven't heard anyone else talk. Maybe Caroline was about to. But I do think that it's important and would consider it, but don't want to step on Caroline's toes either.
You're not stepping on any toes. I agree that the position is important. I'm interested. I would just need to check with my team. We're a small team at Climate Smart, and so I'd want to make sure that it's okay to take that time in the middle of the day. But yeah, Shane, you're more than welcome to the position, though.
Well, we've got interest from 2 people. Great. Well, how about we? Yeah, how about we give? I mean, I'd like to give both of you guys a chance to participate. I mean, Aaron, what do you think? How do you think that could work? Could we have one as an ex officio member potentially, or do you think it would just work best to have a one member and then fill in when one of them couldn't?
The easiest for me would be to have one person appointed to the committee and then have someone else fill in as a proxy as needed.
Great. And Aaron, when's the next meeting?
It'd be this month. So what is that? The 17th? I think it's in 2 weeks.
Okay. In 2 weeks.
2 weeks or 3 weeks. Maybe it's 3 weeks. I'd have to look at a calendar, but yeah, whatever the third Tuesday of this month is. And this meeting should be fairly short, and I'll apologize for there will be some redundant presentations from tonight because we'll be giving similar update, but then we'll also be talking a little bit about what's coming up next year. I'll be giving sort of just a general overview of upcoming projects and things that committee is likely to see. So we'll definitely be able to keep that within an hour, I think, unless there's just really robust conversation on the long range plan.
So the next meeting's on the 15th.
Thanks, Karen.
Do we need to appoint somebody tonight, or can we just, can Caroline and I both try to attend that on the 15th and then we figure it out next time we actually meet?
I like that plan if Aaron's okay with maybe Caroline and Shane just both maybe viewing. Maybe unless you feel like you need, are you guys going to vote on something on the 15th?
I don't think we have any votes coming up. So
Okay.
I don't think we have an issue there. The other thing is, one person could just be designated for the rest of 2021 and then get it, just for that. And you can both attend. I mean, you're more than welcome to both attend. I think that's totally fine and appropriate.
All right. How about, so Shane, you were the first person to speak up. So how about you be appointed if you're willing? We'll have to vote on this, but this is the plan I propose. Shane to be appointed for the rest of 2021, and then for Shane and Caroline to talk off meeting after, between now and our next meeting in January, and decide who will be the nominated representative for next year. And we can do a
rest of 2020.
Yeah, sorry if I said
2021.
Thank you, Caroline. Yep. So Shane will attend as the representative at this next meeting, and Caroline, I think it would be a great idea if you could view the meeting as well, to get a sense for what it is, and then if you two could talk after that and decide what you'd like to do for the next year, and come back to us at our January meeting. Great. Okay, so all in favor of Shane being the TPCC representative for the remainder of 2020, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, wonderful.
I want to say one thing about that. That is a really good potential position for the planning board to be in the future. I mean, you're going to be working with the decision makers for the city and the county, and the planning board has a really good potential role in that, and looking ahead. So thank you, both of you, for taking the opportunity. And I think, yes, the planning board needs to be there. So thank you.
Thanks for saying that, Dave. Totally concur.
One other thing to mention is that I know that at one of the last meetings, the commissioners were thinking the MPO only covers that urban area, and trying to think about how transportation planning interfaces with our more rural areas. And that's a piece that they're really interested in exploring a little bit. We don't do robust transportation planning further out. Obviously, what happens further out affects our transportation system, and vice versa. So that's an area that there's some interest in at the county level, and thinking about how transportation planning and how more rural area growth management connects.
Great. Thanks for that, Karen. Okay, so the last item on the agenda is comments from planning board members, if there are any. If you want to give any updates about how things have been going or what you've been thinking about, this would be the time. Dave?
Yeah, thank you. I want to take this a little off today's topic, but it's about agriculture and future subdivisions we're going to be viewing, and it has to do with agriculture. And I'm going to bring to the attention of everybody, especially Sean, who probably knows this. In a recent issue of High Country News, there's the story about Food Forward, how a co-op of small farmers and ranchers is taking on industrial agriculture. It's about the Spokane area, and Sean probably knows all about that. But I want all of us to think about that in terms of future small-scale agriculture and linkages in this region. And it's such a great article. That's why I'm bringing it to your attention.
That's great, Dave. Was that that's in a recent issue of High Country News?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great publication. I don't know why I let my subscription lapse. I think I get too many things. I can't read everything.
I've been reading this for 25 years. Yeah.
Nice. And I actually don't know about that, Dave, but I have been completely checked out for about 4 or 5 weeks now. So in the high country.
Yes.
It's Dave,
a great magazine, huh?
Would it be too much to ask to scan the article and circulate it? Are we allowed to do that?
You know, they have it online. I think you can read it online, High Country News. Yeah. I don't have that ability to do it anyway myself.
Okay.
But since we go back and forth on this agriculture and the big versus the little, and you know, we have a chance to do something on small scale. I thought that was a great article, and it really focused in on how to do it, but how difficult it is. Anyway, it's Spokane's next door to us, if you will, in terms of regional agriculture. So that's why I brought it up.
Karen, do you think it would be appropriate at all to send, if one of us found a link to this, to send it out to everyone, given that we've discussed the matter in the public forum?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Just don't have a discussion about it.
Yeah.
Just share it and don't talk.
No talking. Okay. So if someone wants to find the link, Dave or other, and share it with us, that'd be great. Okay. Any other comments from folks?
Just one quick comment. I noticed on the agenda for today's meeting that the join the meeting link under attend by computer took me to the open lands meeting, Zoom meeting, instead of the planning board meeting. So just a FYI.
Yes, I think Marty fixed that just before the meeting.
Oh, geez.
So
okay, great.
No,
it wasn't an active meeting. I was just waiting there for a few minutes, and I realized I was waiting for the wrong meeting. So no problem.
Thank you.
We're still getting the hang of this Zoom webinar thing.
No, well, thanks to staff for setting up the new platform. I think it worked really well tonight. So it was certainly smooth from my perspective. And I guess the real test will be at a future meeting when we have lots of folks attending and wanting to speak. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone tonight for your time and great discussion. We'll see. We won't see you to the next year. So have a nice holiday and New Year. We'll see you in January.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.